Fans of Horus Heresy, heavy crawling firepower, and vehicles with origins in the future that have now appeared in the present, thank you very much for joining me for a super review. And this is a super review because I'm going to be reviewing the complete range of Arquitor Bombard weapon loadouts, which we have here. And there are 3 of these vehicles in the form of the Graviton Charge Cannon, the Spicula Rocket Battery, and the Morbus Heavy Bombard. These 3 kits were released by Forge World at the end of 2019 and start of 2020, so I've had them a while. Me being me, I've been doing other stuff. I thought it'd be a good way to review this model by doing all 3 at the same time, and you've probably guessed that I quite like these because I bought all 3. But yeah, I thought it'd be nice to share them. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to showcase the models. These are all from Forge World's Horus Heresy range. I'm going to show you the details, talk about the assembly process, and give you my impression of the kit quality. I'm then going to make some size comparisons against other vehicles and infantry from the Horus Heresy range. And then finally, I'm going to finish up by talking about the rules and tactics for using these in Age of Darkness wargaming. So that's the plan. And without further ado, let's get into this. So, as I said, we have 3 vehicles here. The Specular Rocket Battery, the Graviton Charge Cannon, and the Morbus Heavy Bombard. And these were released in the following order. The Spicula came first, then the Graviton, and finally the Morbus. And the Morbus, I think, was one of the last kits that Forge World released before all the lockdown came in the UK and they had to close shop temporarily and everything got difficult to get hold of. So that's when these came from. And what we have is we have 3 models which are based around the same chassis but with differences between them, which is around the weapon battery, the main weapon, and also a couple of other little fine details, which I'm going to show you. Without further ado, let's start by looking at one of these. So this is the Arquitor Bombard armed with the Graviton Charge Cannon. Now, the first thing that is very striking about this vehicle is its, for want of a better term, back to front appearance. Normally, we're accustomed to vehicles that have the built-up area towards the rear as opposed towards the front, but these are the opposite. And as you probably, you can quite clearly see, that is forward. And there's a driver's compartment. We've got the sponson armament facing that way, the smoke dispensers, and then the main weapon battery. It really is a very interesting looking vehicle, and for me, I'm rather taken by it in that regard because it's one of the least conventional looking models that Forge World have done as far as tanks go. And while, we all love the way that Forge World and indeed 40k make tanks that touch on design concepts and styles from the modern day, it's also nice to do something futuristic, and here they have. But for perhaps interesting reasons, and we'll come back to that. So the general layout is a vehicle, we could characterize it as having twin booms, which are kind of centered around these track units. And then we have probably, I don't know if it's an engine or a crew compartment, which connects those 2. And then at the rear, between the 2 engine booms, we have the weapon assembly. And in this case, we have the Graviton Charge Cannon. On the sides, we have a ladder that leads up onto the decking. We have a sponson with an autocannon in this instance. And then at the front, we have the driver's module. We have a pair of presumably transmission units, and then some targeting equipment and some sort of radar or targeting array mounted here, offset from a driver's module. We have a cupola there and a variety of heat exhausts and fan grills perhaps on the rear of the vehicle. There's 2 banks of 3 forward-firing smoke dispensers. And the vehicle is quite symmetrical, apart from on this side we have obviously the access ladder, a little notch, as I said, the offset crew compartment, and then towards the rear we have 2 sets of exhausts. And these are fairly small exhaust units as far as Astartes vehicles go. And as we'll see, that feeds well into the style of vehicle that this is. Then on the underside, obviously we have the tracks, and we have some nice underside details, and a set of towing lugs. I always like to see towing lugs on a Forge World vehicle. Quite a nice sort of real world style equipment. Well, we've got this. Let's have a look at the Graviton Charge Cannon. Now this is absolutely cool, this. Really, really fascinating looking weapon. We've got the kind of classic Graviton flux bottles, or whatever we call them. Great big heavy power cabling. And then it has a rotary magazine, which actually contains shells, one of which has been, you can just get a better shot there, one of which has actually been taken into the breech for firing. So this is the first Graviton weapon, as far as we can tell, that actually uses a physical projectile. The weapon itself is, in the case of the Graviton Charge Cannon, and the same arrangement exists for the Morbus Heavy Bombard. It's articulated on these two arms, or two cylindrical rollers, and you can see that there are a set of teeth that interlock and regulate the movement. That's quite nice, and I had a lot of fun on all three of these models making this articulate. It's very easy to stick if you want to. A bit more work required to get this happening. At the end of the day, I was really pleased with it. Yeah, overall, a atypical looking Astartes tank, but we've got all the kind of classic design cues that we've come to expect from the Heresy. The crew pod, optics and sensors, these layered armor sections, the style of the exhaust stacks, and then the tracks. So it's unconventional and yet familiar. So there is the first of the three. Now let's actually look at the Morbus Heavy Bombard variant. So everything is the same, with the exception of the main armament. And again, the weapon is mounted between the rear two track units, almost a bit like a catamaran, isn't it? And again, the weapon, the bombard, is articulating on two rollers with teeth. The Morbus Heavy Bombard is an absolutely colossal gun. Again, it has a rotating magazine. This time you can't see the breech. And this has 5 shells. When I was building this and posting pictures over on the Twitters, someone observed that the barrel was too big for the shells. So I made an educated guess as to how big the shell was and bored out the barrel. Instead of the whole thing being a barrel, I'm imagining it has an armoured jacket around the actual barrel itself to protect it from damage. Because as we'll see when we get onto the actual uses of these vehicles, they are forward support vehicles. So the weaponry has to be ready to fire. You don't want cranes loading shells, and you don't want personnel having to load the shells. They are assault vehicles. And yeah, again, you don't have to do this, but you can articulate the magazine to rotate. Let's say it's a magazine. It's like a revolver. I suppose it is a magazine, isn't it? It's like a revolver magazine. And then it has this heavy framing around that magazine to protect it from strikes from above. Yeah, a very hefty looking weapon indeed. So of the three, this is perhaps like the old classic boom style option gun. And again, it has a sensor array here. And then the final one is this, which was the first to be released. And this has got what's called the Spicula Rocket Battery. Now, this is quite a different vehicle in terms of the architecture around the weapon battery. So what you'll notice is, compared to the other two, this has a longer hull. So the entire hull has been extended. And that is to serve as a mounting for the rocket battery. And the rocket battery itself is mounted like that. It has a row of 5, a row of 6, and then another row of 5 rockets in a sort of forward slanted position. It has an armoured shield to protect it from incoming fire from the rear. And then, yeah, it's got a very different style rear decking. Again, this is extended out way beyond what it is on the other 2 vehicles, the Graviton Charge Cannon and the Morbus Heavy Bombard. Got a nice cooling fan detail there. Yeah, I really like that. And it's interesting to see a different approach taken with the vehicle. And now this doesn't do this as supplied. I converted it to do this. I just thought with the other 2 having a moving weapon, I thought I would convert it to do so. And for that, I had to cut away the mounting point, because that is like, it's got a large mount to securely fix it there. I had to fill it, sand it off flat, the whole thing off flat to get nice and flat, mount a magnet in and below. Really nice. It was a lot of work for what I got out of it, but personally, I really enjoyed that. One other thing you'll notice that in terms of the main targeting equipment, or the targeting pod, let's say, which sits next to the driver's capsule, these 2 have got the Specular and the Morbus have got the same design. Just because I was in the mood, I used magnets to, again, articulate these so you can pose this vehicle to a degree. So, for example, you can imagine there, or there. That again was just a bit of fun. It's not necessary, and you can just stick it. But one nice little difference between the Graviton Charge variant is it has a different design of targeting array, as you can see there. And I like to think of that as being something to do with the fact that this is an unusual esoteric energy weapon as opposed to a more conventional projectile type weapon, although we have rockets and bombard. You got essentially like a conventional ballistic type weapon there. So yeah, again, just did that little bit of fun design. So yes, there's an overview of the actual features of these models. Now to talk about the assembly and the kit quality. So in terms of assembly, I did really enjoy building these. The kits themselves were all very well designed. These are the latest kits to come out Forge World, and the general way that they've been created so to go together works well. So the general principle is you've got these 2 big track units, some parts that make up the hull, and then all the details that go around it, and then the weapon system. What I found was, on all of them, I assembled the central crew compartment and hull first, and then attached the side units onto it. Then you fit the transmission blocks in, you fit the lugs in, and then all details as well. In terms of consistent things across the models, well, one thing I did find on every single one was these track units were slightly bowed out that away, like that. And that meant that it just made getting a snug fit on the weapon, and in the case of this, the hull, a bit harder. So what I had to do with all 6 of the side track units was put them in a big cooking dish full of boiled water, let them heat up, soften, and then bend them to shape. On one of them, the Morbus, I really had to, even for me, I had to put all my strength on it to kind of bend it to get it straight. And the reason for that is they've been taken out of the mould when they're not quite fully set. So while the quality of the moulding was fine, to get them straight, certainly for that one, well, they all needed work, but for that one, it was a right fight. I got there in the end. In terms of the actual assembly bit, if you want to articulate these bits, then I had to spend some time just working to take little bits out here and there on the teeth to get a snug fit. I then put some magnets in here and here to make that a tight fit. That's what I did on the first one with the Graviton Charge Cannon. With the Morbus Bombard, I just put dabs of glue onto the ends of the pins, or the firing pin mounts, these long cylinders, just to basically give a friction fit. And I actually think that was better than using magnets. If you want to do that, that's the approach. I can't remember if it was a top or the bottom pin, but I had to kind of get them the same width relative to each other within the socket. So that was something that you had to do. If you're just going to stick it and don't want it to move, that is a lot less of a concern because you just glue it in place and it doesn't matter if it's a bit wobbly because it's going to be stuck. Whereas with wanting it to articulate, that posed a whole set of other challenges. The rest of the build was straightforward. It all went together very well. In terms of quality, they were generally good with a couple of consistent criticisms. And the consistent criticism is around this part of the model. And there was a attachment point here for one of the keys, and it kind of come out a bit distorted. It caused a bit of distortion, and I had to do a lot of cleanup and then rebuilding with filler on all three to restore the shape of the hull at that point. So yeah, that is something you'll have to contend with. The other thing in terms of quality you can probably see already is this bit here, and it kind of had gouges, for want of a better term, in the surface, so it wasn't smooth, and it looks like, I don't know if it's something to do with how the model had been prepared. So I had to do some filling to restore the surface on those three, and perhaps actually this one, now looking at it, you can actually see some of that gouge compared to that one. I wonder why I didn't do this one. Maybe I got sick of it. Or maybe I decided it was okay. I might go back and put a little bit in there. You can see that. So that's something to consider. Again, if you're wanting to get a professional finish. But the main issue I had was getting this bit looking good here. As you can see, I bought 3 of these and I had the same fixes to do on all of them. But setting that aside, I found the build on these really enjoyable. It's such an interesting design. The general kit design is really good and they were a joy to build, so yeah, a lot of fun there. The weapon sponsons I magnetised, which makes them basically easier to transport. I think these 5x3 N35 magnets, I think. And then on the Graviton Charge Cannon one and the Morbus, I did that one first and then I had this idea afterwards. Maybe just went a little bit nuts with magnetisation. And I did this, if I can remember how to get it off. There we go. So I've got to take that off there. Oh yeah, that's it, right. So I have to take that out, take the targeting node out, and then I can slide off the autocannon. And then the alternate weapon that you get, which is a heavy bolter for the sponson, I do the same thing. So I put a magnet in there, slide it on like that, drop the targeting array back in, which I need to do carefully. And now I've got heavy bolter, and I can do that with this side as well. So if you kind of really like your magnetisation, and you really want to go to town with it, with a bit of work, you can do it on these models. And you could apply this principle to any of the sponson weapon systems on similar tanks, such as the Sicaran and the Predators. You know, all those sort of tanks that Forge will do. There's lots, actually. And then we have one armed with heavy bolters on its sponsons. Right, let's now do a size comparison. So I'm going to, what should we do? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. This one. No, we'll do this one, actually. I'm going to take these 2 away, and then we'll do some size comparisons against other models from the Legion list. So let's start off with a Space Marine. Here we have a Word Bearer, and this chap is trying to fit a power flask into his plasma gun. Better be careful, he doesn't want to roll a 1 because of an overheat. And placing him alongside, we can see that it's a fairly big vehicle, and it's certainly tall. Even if we place a Graviton Charge Cannon forward as far as it'll go, you know, the vehicle is almost twice his height. So that is both a pro and a con, we could say. I mean, well, it's a nice big chunky vehicle from one perspective. Pros are you can hide infantry behind it as it advances. Cons are it's a bigger target. So take that as you will. So we have a Space Marine. Let's now ratchet up the size a notch to a battle sarcophagus, and here we have a Dark Angels Contemptor Dreadnought, packing heavy bolters, no doubt with molecular acid shells, and has a good footrest. Great grudge match thing. This model is from a commission Army have built, and we'll be doing a video of that on the channel at a later date. Yeah, Contemptor Dreadnought. Next to a Contemptor, well, the Contemptor is probably about the same height, smokestack to gun. But if we elevate the gun to the maximum, then the tank's a little taller. If we put the gun to the minimum, the Dreadnought is just a touch ahead. Let's now move to a comparison against some contemporary tanks. Firstly, we've got a light marine tank, a Sabre tank destroyer. This one's armed with a neutron blaster and a multiple melter, and of course it's 4 Sabre missiles. And of course, this is a relatively recent release as well for the Legiones Astartes in Horus Heresy. So here we can see that the Arquitor is substantially taller, substantially wider, probably about a third in each dimension so far. And then likewise on the length, and yeah, I mean it's about a third longer, a third taller, and a quarter wider. So yeah, quite a big vehicle compared to the Sabre. Let's add a medium Legiones Astartes tank. Here we have a Predator. This one is armed, well, this is a Predator. Is this a Predator Annihilator? I think so. And it is armed with a heavy conversion beam cannon. Great looking weapon, very esoteric. Again, this is part of the Dark Angels, as it is the Sabre. And alongside the Aquator, I mean, the Predator is bigger, but the Aquator is still, I don't know, actually, with the gun fully forward or the charge cannon fully depressed, they're probably about the same height. The Predator is just a little shorter gun up than the Aquator's taller, but the main hull on the Aquator is quite tall compared to the Predator. Width-wise, the Aquator is maybe about, excluding the sponsons, maybe about 15% wider. And lengthwise, it's probably about a quarter longer, excluding the dozer blade. With the dozer blade on, it's probably around 10% longer. So yes, there's a comparison against light and medium tanks of Legiones Astartes. Now let's move those guys into the background and bring in a heavy Legiones Astartes tank in the form of a Land Raider Proteus. And this is of the Dark Angels. This is an absolutely fantastic model. Again, part of the Dark Angels commission. A video to come on this. So yeah, absolute monster these things are. Now, what do we find if we compare the Arquitor to this guy? Let's get those two a little bit out of shot. There we go. So the Land Raider is most definitely taller with the gun forward, but the actual hull on the Land Raider is, you know, to the top of the tracks compared to the Arquitor is taller. With the gun up, it's probably a little bit taller, the Arquitor. Width-wise, I'm saying they are the same, excluding the sponsons. And lengthwise, you'll have to exclude the distortion of the camera angle. The Arquitor is just a smidge, just a soupçon longer than the Land Raider. So there you go, a comparison against light, medium, and heavy tank types of the Legiones Astartes. So as you can see, the Arquitor is in the same sort of size league as the heavy tank, the Land Raider. Okay, so let's take these away. We'll bring back our other two friendly Arquitors, and then we will move on to a discussion of the rules. Now this is kind of like interesting when we look at the rules for this vehicle. Right, so let's do an overview of the general rules to start with. My source is Horus Heresy Book 9 Crusade. The rules for this are found on pages 200 and 201. So let's go over the stats. Armour stats first. It is ballistic skill 4, front and side armour is 12, rear is 10. It has 4 hull points. Unit composition. You can take this as a heavy support choice with between 1 and 3 Arquitors in a tank squadron. The unit type is a vehicle, a tank, and a heavy. And its war gear is 1 hull-mounted Morbus Heavy Bombard, 2 sponson-mounted heavy bolters, smoke launchers, searchlight, and an auxiliary drive. And the points cost is 140. In terms of weapon options, you can substitute the Morbus Heavy Bombard for either a Spicula Rocket System or a Graviton Charge Cannon, and there is no additional cost to do that. So regardless of the primary weapon, it is 140 points. The Arquitor has a number of options. You can exchange the heavy bolters on the sponsons for autocannons for 10 points. You can also take a pintle-mounted weapon. You can take a twin-linked bolter at 5 points, a combi weapon at 5 points, or a havoc launcher at 15 points. And all Arquitor bombards in a squadron can take armoured ceramite at 20 points per tank, or extra armour at 10 points per tank. In terms of the weapon options, you can mix and match between vehicles in the squadron. But the vehicle upgrades, so the armour types and the ceramite, has to be applied to all. So weapon stats. So in terms of all the standard weapon stats, we know that. So let's start with the main weapon systems. All of the main weapon systems have a range of 24 inches. So they're all kind of like fairly short range as far as tanks go. For the Morbus Bombard, it has 2 ammunition types. Explosive shells, which is range 24, strength 10, AP 2, ordnance 1, barrage, and large blast 5. So it's basically a demolisher cannon with barrage. It also has what are called carcass shells, and these are a particularly horrifying bioweapon. The range is 24 inches again, strength is 2, the AP is 4. The rules on this is interesting. It is ordnance 1, barrage, large blast 5, but it has fleshbane, ignores cover, and pinning. So that means that this against most living targets is going to be wounding on 2s. If you're shooting militia or auxilia, then they won't get any saving throw. Combined with the ignores cover means this is an absolutely devastating weapon to use against non-Astartes troops, and even against things like Talax cyborgs. Also, they get no armor save against it. Rather potent, that is. The next weapon is a Graviton Charge Cannon. It is AP4, range 24, ordnance 1, large blast 5, barrage, concussion, graviton pulse, and haywire. So what we have here is the first indirect fire graviton weapon, and this is essentially the same as a graviton cannon mounted on a rapier battery, but this time it's got the barrage capability, and that's the only difference. So everything else is the same. Well, actually, there's one other difference, sorry, it's ordnance. Does that really matter? It does from a point of view of fire and maneuver, but because you're not making AP rolls with a Graviton Charge Cannon, it doesn't matter from the point of view of damage. And finally, the Specular Rocket System, again range 24, strength 7, AP 3, ordnance 1, blast 5 or 7 inches, rocket salvo, sunder, and wrecker. Now, this is a funny weapon, and it's really quite intriguing. When you fire it, you are not bound by the normal targeting limitation of having to place a center hole over a base. As long as a model is in the blast area, in the target unit, you can put the template there. So that gives this thing a lot of freedom in terms of where it can shoot. And it's done like that to represent the rockets firing a saturation attack. And there's no need for the sort of precision that other weapons would have, just because of the sheer number of shots that are going to be fired. And I also like to imagine that each one has got like a cluster bomb warhead type thing, which fragments into more parts. That's how I imagine it. Now, it's got Sunder and Wrecker, and it's ordnance, so you're going to be getting lots of re-rolls on armor penetration. Well, not re-rolls, but rolling 2 dice, picking the best. Ordnance and Sunder or Wrecker means, against anything with armor 13 or less, this thing is going to do a lot of pounding. It's very potent. You can also fire in 2 ways. So if you remember, I said you can do a 5 or a 7-inch blast. If you do a 5-inch blast, it does 5 hits within the blast area, and you can then allocate those per normal rules. However, if you go for the 7-inch blast, it increases to D6 plus 4, so you can score up to 10 hits. On average, you're going to score 7.5, so between 7 and 8 hits. But at strength 7, AP3, that's a lot of firepower. Great against Mechanicum robots like the Castellax and the Domitar, and it'll absolutely shred Vorax robots. However, if you roll a 6 when you make the number of hits roll, you exhaust the ammunition on the battery and the Spicula can no longer fire for the rest of the battle. My personal view, unless you have a reason not to, because you've got friendlies nearby, always fire the 7-inch for the maximum hits. For a 1 in 6 chance of going out of ammo for those extra hits, do it. The difference is, compared to normal blast weapons, is you can only score the number of hits that you roll on that dice. Like a really good, well-placed shot from the Morbus, if you had a tightly grouped squad of men, you could maybe hit 10 or more. With this, you can only score up to 4 plus d6 hits in total. The difference is, this is far better against point targets than this. With this, you can only do 1 hit. Great if it's like a tank, which can crack in 1 shot. But if you're shooting let's say, a Mechanicum heavy robot like a Thanatar or a Castellax, you can only do 1 wound. This thing against a Castellax, you can potentially do up to 10 wounds. It's very interesting as a shooting unit, and rules-wise, something they've not quite done before, so I do like that. Now, let's talk about tactics, because this is an interesting unit, particularly in the context of the other forces that are available to the Legiones Astartes, because we've got like a bit of an example of a very crowded range of capabilities. And at first glance, you might think these things don't do something new, but I'm going to point out where I do think they do things new. So firstly, general thoughts on them. Well, the obvious thing, so they are heavy vehicles, so you can only ever move 6, which kind of makes sense. They're big, heavy tanks, they're slow moving. As you remember from earlier in the review, I mentioned about the small exhausts, and that indicates a less powerful engine. I like that. If you contrast that with the Sabre, which is a fast vehicle, this has got 2 huge, great exhaust stacks, indicating it's a very powerful engine it's packing. So you can only ever move 6. But it's designed as an infantry tank for those of you who know anything about World War I armour and early World War II armour, particularly in the British Army. You will understand the concept of an infantry tank. It only needs to move at the pace of the infantry because that is what it's designed to do. It's not designed as a breakthrough vehicle. So that in itself is fine. Now, using these tactically, all 3 main weapons are ordnance, and unfortunately that means when you're firing the main battery, you can't use the secondary arms at full ballistic skill. You can only snapshot. And that, I think, is a bit of a limitation, particularly given that you have no choice but to take sponsons. So a lot of vehicles in the Space Marine list have this issue. Quite a few of them offset it from a point of view of player choice by making the sponson optional. For example, obviously, Predator is one of those. And you can't fit the Arquitor with a machine spirit either, so there's no way to offset that penalty of firing an ordnance weapon when you're moving. You got to kind of like weigh up if the sponson weapons are worth taking. And you also need to think about that in terms of the pintle weapons. If you put a Havoc launcher on this thing, once you get into main weapon range, you're never going to be able to fire it because it's a blast weapon and you can't snap fire blast weapons. So that's a limitation of gunning these things because of the ordnance nature of the main gun. That said, this is where I'd level a criticism of the way the rule set works at the moment with regards to the heavy vehicle rule. I don't think the heavy vehicle rule is doing what it should be doing. It's doing what it should be doing in terms of having slow-moving vehicles. Yeah, that's right. But when you look at those vehicles, i.e. these, and the Minotaur artillery tank, I kind of imagine that the flip side to that is they will be heavy, stable platforms. And personally, I think the heavy vehicle rule should limit you to 6 inches of movement, yeah, but allow you to fire all weapons at full ballistic skills. Or you could turn it another way around and say, if the vehicle type is heavy, it can move and fire all weapons at full ballistic skill. And that then would make a lot more sense of the sponson weapon options and the pintle weapon options, which otherwise are a little bit redundant. You're not going to get the full value out of them. Probably with this one it works best because you've got strength 7 autocannons and strength 7 missiles, so even with snapshots, it's adding to the strength 7 barrage. So, I can see that's quite a good synergy. But on the others, yeah, a bit less so. But yeah, so that's something I think that should be generally changed in the Heresy rule set, is a heavy vehicle should allow you to move and fire all weapons at full ballistic skill. Right, what else then do we think on the rules with these? So as a tank, they're tough at 4 hull points, the same as a Land Raider. The armour is average at 12, 12, 10. The rear armour of 10 is quite weak, and most marine tanks are tougher than that. Certainly, when you look at the advanced ones, like the Sicaran, so it is vulnerable from the rear, but, front ways, 12, it's okay, but it's not as tough as a Predator, and it's certainly not as resilient as a Land Raider, and a Predator is the same as a Sicaran. So, yeah, it does have that slight more vulnerability, despite being a vehicle designed to move with the infantry, and that is going to expose it to fire, particularly as it's quite big. So you've got to weigh that up with this as well. Now, the final thing then to consider in terms of putting these into armies is there are a lot of other vehicles that do a similar thing, particularly to this guy, and specifically I'm thinking of the Medusa siege gun and the Vindicator with Demolisher Cannon. Now, stats-wise, the Vindicator is identical damage-wise to this, as is a Medusa. It's the same hitting power, strength 10, AP2, large blast. The Medusa gun has barrage like this, but that also has 50% more range at 36 inches. The Vindicator's got the same range at 24, but that is direct fire only. So the Vindicator has a disadvantage compared to this of only being direct fire. From a Force Org point of view, there's no difference. You can buy all of them in squadrons of 3, and points-wise, they are all sort of in the ballpark. 140 of this is actually relatively cheap for what you get when you consider the secondary armament. It comes with a auxiliary drive included, which would normally extra points. The auxiliary drive helps it keep pace with the infantry because it allows you to re-roll failed terrain tests. That's a good thing. In terms of the other two, I think this one, I'm fairly happy with that. As a weapon system, this one's really good. And the way the Specular works, it brings something really new to the Marine arsenal, and it helps fill another hole that they have in capability for fighting against Mechanicum. Don't forget, Marines classically find the Mechanicum hard opponents because the Mechanicum are kind of geared up to kill the Marines. But these rocket batteries are going to be great against their robots and cyborgs. I think against Mechanicum and Marines, this is a great weapon thing. And the autocannons make sense even for snapshots to add to the strength 7 barrage. Now, finally, we've got the Graviton Charge Cannon. Now, this is a bit of a funny one, but in certain armies, it could do something useful. If you wanted a tank army with, entirely tank-based, with no infantry or other equivalents, then this now gives you the way to get the capability of the Graviton Cannon with the haywire effect and the large blast area denial template through the Graviton Pulse rule. It allows you to put that into your vehicle-only army. So it does fill a little bit of a gap in the Marine capability list. Also, as an indirect Graviton weapon, I think it's quite interesting. And if you were to twin this up with some troops who had Nuncio Voxers, then I think you can really start having some fun with lobbing Graviton blasts into places that you wouldn't otherwise be able to. So again, I think it has a use. And in absolute terms, if you want a massive Graviton spam army, it allows you to use a heavy support slot to get lots of Graviton cannon effect weapons without having to fill out elites with rapiers. So that again, that's another benefit that particular weapons configuration offers. So overall, I think it's kind of an unusual tank in that there's a lot of other things that do something similar, but not in quite the same way as these three. And compared to the other platforms I talked about, the Vindicator and the Medusa, these are tougher. They're better armoured overall when you consider the side armour, and they are tougher as well with 4 as opposed to 3 hull points. So they do have that benefit also. At the end of the day, you've got to kind of look at your own army, what you want to achieve with that in terms of how it plays on the table, and then pick the vehicles that suit it best. Personally, I've got an idea to use these in a Black Shields army because I see them as being relatively low-tech marine vehicles, and it's going to be quite an aggressive infantry force. So infantry tanks make a lot of sense to go alongside it. And, aside from all that, regardless of what you think about the gaming meta, it is do you like the models? And as I said, I really like the design of this. I really enjoyed building the 3, that's why I bought 3 of them, and I'm really glad I bought them for that reason alone. And on the design, there's one thing I've not talked about yet, and I will do now, which is an interesting finish. And this is a vehicle which is, I talked about the unusual back to front facing design. Well, for those of you who haven't already realised, this is a historical precursor to the 40k Death Guard, what's it called? Blightcrawler, isn't it? Is it Blightcrawler? I think it is. If I got that name wrong, I'll put it on the screen now. And we'll just have a quick look at that in an image, and you can see how this vehicle of Nurgle has got the same back to front arrangement and a large cannon. And I think in the case of the Arquitor, one of the things they were doing when they designed it is they wanted to design something in the Marine Legions which was a precursor to the Blightcrawler, which came later and was a degenerated and mutated version of that. That's a interesting feature of its design. It's very similar in concept to the Vulturax Strato Automata, which is supposed to be a distant ancestor to the Blight drone that Forge will do for present-day 40k. You know, similar thing with these as being a precursor to the Blightcrawler. Nice bit of 40k lineage and history there. That is everything I'd like to say about the Legion Arquitor Bombard tank, produced by Forge World as part of their Horus Heresy range. So yes, it's been a long review covering the 3 tanks, because as always, I like to try to cover the detail and explore the options and give you my opinions. So yes, thank you very much for watching along. I hope you found this an interesting video. As always, I would like to hear your thoughts and observations about these absolutely fascinating Marine Legion vehicles. Please leave those in the comment section. But other than that, I'd just like to say thank you very much for watching. I'll speak to you next time, and goodbye.